Do we have a feel for if everyone's on yet? You could just give me the high sign.
We have about 9 right now.
Mhm.
If you want to start.
Okay. Let me see.
Yeah, we're going up now, so you're good.
All right. Thank you everyone for taking the time to go through this orientation session. I know this was somewhat short notice. Really appreciate it. Once again, thank you for your commitment to be a part of the Spark process. I really appreciate it. I'm John Paralisi. I'm the Spark director, project director, who is brought on board in December to help structure the process as well as to facilitate it. So if you could go to the next slide. In terms of this particular orientation session, one thing to know up front is that this session is a little different in terms of how it's being conducted than the advisory panel sessions. The advisory panel sessions moving forward within each advisory panel are going to be done virtually, the virtual backbone, just because of the timing and where everyone's located. And those sessions will be typical Zoom meetings where they'll be back and forth and real-time conversations. So this one's more of a webinar format. Because this one's a webinar format, as we go through it, there should be a lot of time to be able to answer questions at the end. But if you have a question as we're going through it, please log it in the chat, and we will continue to capture those questions and then talk about them at the end. So thanks for that. So in terms of the objectives for this meeting, if you go back, it's really just to orient everyone on the overall Spark process and the advisory panelist role within that, once again, and then to answer questions at the end. But this is just kind of general orientation, giving everyone the lay of the land. Next slide. So in terms of the contents, there's going to be a little bit of back up and talk about Spark and the Spark process, how it came to be, how the advisory panels fit within that structurally, as well as more detail. So those things may actually not be new to you, or to at least most of you. The third piece gets into more detail about the advisory panel working process. That will be new, and what types of outputs we'll be looking for to come out from the other end of the process to feed into the Spark committee as they take the inputs from the advisory panels to create a integrated set of priorities. And then the last one is just give a heads up in terms of the next steps as we start moving out with each one of the advisory panels. Next slide. I'm sure most of you probably know, but the Spark committee was created a number of months ago last year, and it represents a fairly broad group of people from both sides of the aisle, as well as public and private representatives. And they have been meeting, and the meetings have been streamed for several months now. And I work on their behalf. Next slide. This is a really important slide. This is a set of guiding principles that the Spark committee put forward a while back. And it's really important, not only because it represents how they want to approach this, but also this led to how we structured the process to make sure that we were able to deliver against these outcomes together. So the first one is prioritize sustainable programs and investments. So wherever possible, make sure that we are, targeting one-time use of funds, catalytic investments. And really the second point is understanding that there are a lot of sources of funds, for instance, the infrastructure bill. And we need to understand where the sweet spot is within each one of these panels based on kind of the unique aspects of these discretionary funds. Because there are some things that will be high priorities, but they may be better served, for instance, coming out of the infrastructure bill. And we have set up the process so that we can help the panels think about that. The third one is fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansans. So how it's been described to me is, I want to be able to be standing 10 years from now, looking back and saying, at the things that we prioritized, that they were kind of catalytically important for putting Kansas on a path to a better future. Considering equitable opportunities and outcomes obviously is critical, and that links as well into the allowability rules that have come from Treasury, from federal, around how these funds are used. Enable flexibility within investment strategies. And one thing to say up front as well is that, some of the things coming into the funnel to be evaluated and even going up to the Spark Committee, some may be more programmatic in nature, where we're targeting this type of a need with this type of things, but it may be coming out in smaller increments over time, or it may be a large project. So there are going to be, different types of opportunities that come out of this process. And then lastly, ensuring the results are measurable, enable tracking and transparency. And we also leverage that into how we want to approach this process as well. Next slide. So just to ground everyone, there have been a lot of funds that have gone to Kansas over the last couple of years. The focus of this, though, is the $1.6 billion that, in the Spark project. There's also $1 billion worth of local funds and the infrastructure bill that will probably have a decent amount of potential synergy with these particular funds. Go to the next slide. But one thing to note is, against that $1.6 billion, there already has had about $869 million allocated in 2021. So what we are really looking at is about $731 million in funds remaining, which obviously can be transformative in and of themselves. And there are some cases where this number may actually grow a bit depending upon what happens around some of the previously allocated funds as well. Next slide. So, in terms of the allowability, we talked about, the guiding principles of the Spark Committee, but there are also allowability guidelines from Treasury. And so the thing to know here is that we will be having experts, particularly Whit O'Brien, which really knows this inside and out, that can help us understand kind of where opportunities may fit within these guidelines, and in a lot of cases, maybe even how to kind of shape some opportunities to be able to fit within the guidelines. But some things that are always allowable are, on the left, responding to the public health emergency, addressing negative economic impacts of COVID, premium pay, offset cuts in government services, and then investments in things like water, sewer, stormwater, broadband. There are a number of things that aren't allowable, or a few things. And then there are a lot of things that are really kind of conditionally allowable, particularly if they're targeted against groups, populations, and potentially even industries that were disproportionately impacted by COVID. Next slide. So just structurally, this is where the advisory panels sit within the entire process. So the 4 advisory panels are meant to be the groups that are creating the recommendations for those areas that would go to the Spark Committee, for the Spark Committee then to make some trade-offs around creating an integrated set of priorities to go to the State Finance Council for approval. Something to note here is that one of the ways that we want to structure this is that is for the Spark Committee to be seeing more funding opportunities coming from the advisory panels than they can fund. The reason being for that, one of the goals that's been noted has been, when by a Spark member is, when I say yes to something, I want to understand what I'm saying no to. So the thought is to provide a portfolio of high priority opportunities, but give the Spark Committee the opportunity at that level to be able to make some trade-offs on an integrated basis, and leaving them the time in order to be able to take some of those considerations. And as the project director, I am helping the panel chairs. I helped structure the whole process, working with the other groups, the other support groups that we'll talk about later, as well as assisting the panel chairs in moving through that process and acting as a contact point, a bridging point with the Spark Committee, between the Spark Committee and the advisory panels. Next slide. I'm not going to try and go through this slide in detail. The point on this is that, one, there are some potential overlaps between the advisory panels, between each other and between other funding sources. So we wanted to note that. And also within each one of the advisory panels, there are some kind of areas of focus that had been identified in the months, even before I came on board, really, around places where people are interested in really trying to hone in. So this was developed to give you a feel for, when we talk about something as broad as economic revitalization, what are the things to really have top of mind. If there are proposals that come in, or the advisory panels themselves, brainstorm on some additional opportunities or ideas that may fall somewhat outside of these areas, then that's within their purview in order to be able to expand some of these definitions. Next slide. And this was kind of going into the process, how the advisory panel model was described in terms of making sure that there were correct representation of enough people with enough different perspectives to be able to come at the issues within that advisory panel from a knowledgeable standpoint and from different angles. The time commitment was expected to be a couple meetings a month, 2 to 4 hours. We may challenge that a little bit in terms of, maybe another meeting a month, but maybe not quite as long a meeting, and potentially even with some homework in between. From a governance standpoint, each panel has 2 chairs. And they are, have the full responsibility and control for leading the panels. And I am supporting them in this process, as is, a lot of research support and other support from a number of different angles. So the support team that I've been working with includes resources from the Office of Recovery, KLRD. We're going to work with the chairs in order to, where they think it makes sense, bring in expert input. And then we also have 2 consulting firms that are involved, BCG, who's staffed to provide pretty significant support, both during and in between all of the sessions, and also has been a primary driver in helping pull together some of the fact books and pre-reads that will be sent out to everyone shortly. As well as Whit O'Brien, which will be providing expertise in particular around allowability and thinking about allowability in each one of the advisory panels. Next slide. So this is just in more detail, kind of what I explained before, bringing a lot of resources to bear, particularly given, once again, the fact we know this is a night job for everyone on these panels. As well as kind of the timing that we have. So, we are bringing a lot of resources in the case of KLRD and the Office of Recovery, being able to leverage them, on a part-time basis, but we will have points of contact there, and some of them full-time. But from a BCG and Whit O'Brien standpoint, having dedicated resources to be able to support this process and assist all of the panels going forward. Next slide. So this is a pretty busy slide, but I'll walk you through it just to give everyone a feel for what the cadence of this process looks like. So if you go down to underneath advisory panels where the meetings are, the first meeting is this orientation session. So, not within a specific advisory panel. And then basically the flow in all of the panels is going to be, particularly over the rest of January, February, March, and into April timeframe, is to one, kind of form as advisory panels and really understand the situation. What's the data in terms of where Kansas stands, benchmarking data about where it stands versus other states, what's happening in other states in some of these areas, particularly with regards to these funds, potential, early views in terms of where the core needs might be. And so the goal at the start is really just to make sure that there is a fact base and a common view of the situation and identification of what the needs are. The next step is really to make sure that we go back and all the ideas over the last number of months that have been put forward get submitted into a common submittal format that got launched yesterday, and any other additional ideas get launched in that format, as well as the expectation is that the role of the advisory panels really isn't just to evaluate ideas that come in. It really is to start with the needs in each one of those areas, see some of those ideas, but also brainstorm against those needs. And it could be that some advisory panels, most of the ideas that come out at the end may not purely reflect an idea that was submitted. It may be, based on a number of those ideas, but there's going to be an awful lot of work by the advisory panel itself in order to be able to kind of think of creative ways to address the needs. So once all the ideas are on the table, then filtering the ideas to understand, kind of which ones just might be non-starters from the standpoint of the, Spark Committee guideline goals and the allowability guidelines from Treasury. To get down to the list of viable ideas, which would then continue to be fleshed out. And that's where kind of all the support resources can come in handy for sure. And then score those ideas against criteria that basically look at the potential impact in a variety of different ways, as well as feasibility, equity, and other considerations. So that's around, meeting 4. And there might be a slightly different cadence for each one of the advisory panels, depending upon what situation they're starting out with. And then once those ideas have been scored, the opportunity for the panel itself to step back and say, okay, what kind of portfolio recommendation do we really want to put forward to the Spark Committee? Because it may be that an idea may not have scored quite as high, but if it's an enabler for a lot of high scoring ideas, you'd want to make sure that went forward. So, maybe in some cases also packaging the ideas into a few themes could make sense. So it would be in late March that the advisory panel chairs, early April would be, if you go all the way up to the Spark Committee level on the diagram, presenting to the Spark Committee and talking through the portfolios that they came up with the potential to be able to then iterate back down to answer any questions, working with the panels, with the goal that in May, preferably early May, we'll see if this ends up slipping, as we get into setting all the dates and into the workflows, for the Spark Committee itself to have put together an integrated set of priorities to go to the Finance Council. And once again, it could be, we're making the point that it could be that, there could be $2 billion worth of funding ideas coming up to them from the advisory panels, but they're going to take an aggregate view to say, overall, what do we think the priorities are given the size of the pot that we really have to work with. Next slide. This is a slide that really is looking at some of the things I just talked through, but from a graphical sense from each advisory panel. And, also one thing to keep in mind is that all the numbers on the slide are just purely illustrative. They're just directional to make the point that each one of the panel is going to be receiving or themselves creating a list of ideas, from a variety of sources, which includes the advisory panel themselves brainstorming, research on what other states are doing, needs assessments, internal, external interviews, community input. There have been listening sessions that have been going on for months, expert input. There are a lot of inputs that will be kind of feeding into that set of ideas. And as I mentioned, the support team has already working to take the ideas that have been submitted before and working with the people who submitted them to make sure that we have them in a common format so that the advisory panels can make, can compare them over time. And even anything that the advisory panels themselves come up with, we'd want to put it into that common format. But once going through the filtering lens on things like allowability and fit, it might end up being 100 ideas that are viable, and those are the ideas that we'd want to spend more time on detailing and eventually prioritizing to create a short list and understanding how individually each idea stacks against that scoring matrix. But then at the end, going through and having what we call an objectives lens to understand from a portfolio standpoint, what do we want to put forward, identifying themes or enablers that may be missing. And then at the end, that's what would be going to the Spark team, the Spark committee. Next slide. This is just illustrative really at this point. We're continuing to work through it. But it really is a way of thinking about, a scoring matrix in terms of impact and looking at what the core impact might be in terms of level of impact, scope of it, duration of it, also looking at equity, as well as on difficulty, workability, executability, fiscal sustainability, coming up with a total score for each. So, there would, which would require having a weighting for each one of those areas and then a scoring for each one of those items for that idea. In so many of the ideas are going to be targeted against different things that it isn't going to be possible to just be able to compare things based on ROI. So, the challenge is here is, how to create a common way of looking at the ideas, as well as, so that's going to require in some cases, we'll be able to put hard data against some of these things. In some cases, it's going to be more judgment based. Next slide. Oh, and stay on the slide, but one point to make is the scoring on those things is going to be the advisory panel. That's going to, it's going to be the advisory panel's judgment against those things. The support group will support there as much as possible, but ultimately the keys are in the hands of the advisory panels. This slide is really just one example of a frame, just one frame you could look to understand the portfolio based on kind of against the prioritization of the ideas that came out. So for instance, understanding in the portfolio, you may have some things that are, will really have high impact, but they're pretty difficult. Some of you want some of those, they could be potential home runs. And I actually, I'm a baseball fan. So, I kind of think about that trade-off between home runs and singles. We don't want to not go for things that may not be as much of a home run, but they're easy to do, kind of no-brainer things. So we would imagine that each one of the advisory panels would be thinking across their ideas around this. Next slide. So just as we go through the process as well, one thing for the panelists to be thinking about kind of in summary is, is the proposed initiative an allowable use of ARPA funds? And once again, there may be some opportunities for shaping and focus around them that would, make them more allowable. Are there other sources of funding available? There may be some things that are great ideas, but they really don't fit in the sweet spot of these funds. Is the initiative expected to have a high impact for Kansans? Promote equity, be feasible to implement, and really, that's the core part of what the Spark Committee wants to focus on, as well as really driving towards catalytic investments, one-time investments that can have that long-term impact. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but and I think I've talked about it a little bit up until now, but it's, how to think about an investment portfolio. One thing to note is that it may be is that we get into some of these, that we may also decide maybe it makes sense to give kind of a high, medium, and low, investment recommendations, from one of the panels or more of the panels to say, okay, well, here's kind of like the minimal level to invest, and here are the things that would go into that, maybe because they're foundational elements. If you went to a higher funding level, you would add these things on. If you went to a higher funding level, you would add these things on. So kind of a few recommendation scenarios. Next slide. So in terms of the outputs for all the viable ideas that make it through the filtering stage, the goal would be for the Spark Committee to be able to have, kind of clear, concise one-pager as a summary on each. There can be backup around these as well, but really to be able to have kind of one common view of being able to look at these. And once again, the support team will be working heavily to help pull all of this stuff together. The goal for the advisory panels is to really use their judgment. Any research or anything that can be done kind of behind the curtain, we'll try and make sure that we can leverage the support teams to assist the advisory panelists on that. Next slide. And one other point I'd make on the previous slide, we don't need to go back to it, is that the thought would be that each advisory panel would also submit here's just a list of ideas that really didn't even make it through as viable ideas, just so that the Spark Committee can see the ideas that kind of really didn't even make it through that first tranche of the funnel. So for the viable ideas, being able to show how those ideas scored. And the next slide is the ultimate, here's the portfolio being put forward. Now, the one thing I'll say about the whole process and about how we've structured these outputs is that, this is a bit of a first time around this process, particularly in Kansas. So, we have worked really hard to have a process that, we've tried to articulate, even formulaically from end to end as best we could, to make sure that it flowed and to give everyone an idea of how the process is going to work and how information will flow. But the one thing I know is that things will probably deviate along the way, and we're going to need to make adjustments, and it might be a little messy at points. And that I think is just a given going into this. And so when we see any issues like that or places where we need to adjust, we'll just adjust to make sure that this works with the desired end results. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps, and then we'll start going through, open it up for Q&A through the chat, and looks like we already got some questions in the chat. We'll answer those as best we can. But next steps for the advisory panels, one would be to familiarize yourselves with the COMA and CORA rules, as well as review the SFRF guidelines and allowability. But once again, at a more detailed level around the ideas, we'll be providing expertise to help think about those things. And on the investment portfolio development side, review the pre-reads materials. And a lot of work has been put into pulling together pre-reads that analytically lay out the situation within the state in those areas, as well as seeing what some other states are doing, and share that investment idea submission form. So, and those pre-reads are going to be going out pretty quickly, and I'm going to start meeting with the panel chairs again next week to start working on kind of some of the detailed plans around getting the advisory panels up and moving as early as next week. So once again, the other thing I would just note again, once again, realize this is a night job for everyone. Really appreciate that. This is an aggressive timeline, but the goal is to get to those integrated decisions, within that time. And the good news is that, we have been, this has been in process for a while. So we're coming in with a lot of information into the process, but realize, particularly at the start, it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose. So with that, I will start answering questions coming through the chat.
Thanks, John. You answered this a little bit, but could you just expand a little bit more on how research will be conducted for the ideas, what's expected of panelists, and what will be done for them?
Yeah. In terms of research for the ideas, I mean, depending upon the idea, it could be any combination of the Recovery Office, KLRD, BCG, Widow O'Brien's, working to flesh out the idea with a panelist or whatever is required, probably with if it was submitted by someone with the group that submitted it. So the goal is that, whatever is required outside of the meetings, we're going to make sure we resource it so that can happen.
Thanks, John. And just to confirm, everyone will get has gotten a copy of this presentation.
Yeah. The goal is for everyone to have a copy of this presentation. Yep.
I believe Emily's bringing up the submission form just so everyone can see it. But please keep asking questions in the chat.
One quick question: has the core cheat sheets been sent out? I believe it's in all the pre-read materials, a link to it. But anybody? Okay, it will get sent out. All right. So yesterday, this submission form went live, and it got communicated to all the panelists, all the legislators, press release, as well as we are now moving to talk with all the people who submitted ideas to date, going back months in terms of listening sessions or the number of other ideas that have come in, talking with agencies in each one of these areas to make sure that we capture all of the ideas and that we're able to put them in this format. And the one thing I'd say too is that as the advisory panels themselves come up with ideas, we're going to make sure that we can answer all of these questions as well around those ideas. Once again, the only way to really work through this process is to have a way of looking at these ideas in a common way.
We're getting a couple of logistical questions. So first, John, just to confirm, everyone will get these materials sometime after this meeting. And then also, do we know when invitations will start going out for panel meetings or what that process will look like?
Yeah, we have been getting and most of you have already submitted your availabilities going forward. And so we're going to sit down with the panel chairs and look at the availabilities and bump them up against, the timeline and come to agreement on when we'd want to schedule, at the very least, the first session. So once again, it would be nice and almost required to have at least a kickoff session by the end of next week for the panels. But it might be a little challenging for everyone to be able to make it to every single panel meeting within their advisory panel. And in those cases, they are going to be streamed and recorded. And we can work from a support group standpoint to make sure that if someone for some reason can't make one of the sessions, they won't miss a beat. We'll keep them, in the loop on everything that is happening.
Thanks, John. If anyone else, oh, there we go. There's a, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just saw the one on submissions. Right now, we're working on, the submissions are going to be, it's just been opened up for anyone new that wants to put in a submission. So as they come in over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be sharing them with the panels. We'll do it in such a way that they can actually absorb, that you can all absorb the information. Like I said, we're also going back and taking all the previous ideas and making sure that they are put into that format as well. So my guess is over the next 3 weeks or so, and I don't have necessarily kind of a firm view on that, we will be getting to the panels and the panelists. Here is the full slate of ideas submitted to date and how they're growing.
And John, if a panelist has a conflict of interest with different ideas that are being submitted through the process, how would that be handled?
Well, just acknowledging the conflict of interest would be good. We got this question on the session yesterday, and the thought was if someone is on the panel, if they're related to an organization that's submitting an idea, they shouldn't be submitting it themselves, but it shouldn't disqualify the organization itself from submitting the idea. And on the panel, they're just one panelist as well. So, the risk may not be quite as high from that standpoint of conflicts of interest because the whole panel is going to be looking at the ideas and evaluating them.
Thanks, John. And then how will the fit of ideas be assessed? Is that through the form?
Yeah, the submission form asks, it provides that description of what falls into each one of the advisory panels and asks the person submitting to define one or more panels that it may fit with. And then we're going to be looking, the support group on the back end, to really think through which panel it belongs with. So that's how it's going to work.
And I believe it's being shown on the screen, what people will see when they're submitting the form.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our panelists?
And like I said, all this information, it's going to be shared. As soon as we have it, a bunch of this information is going to be shared. Some has been shared already. This information is going to be shared today. And then the pre-reads are going to be, we're going to get them to you as soon as we possibly can. And it's certainly going to be before the kickoff sessions because those pre-reads in most cases are fairly substantial. So there's a lot to absorb there. I just thought the sessions, they will be virtual, built on a virtual backbone. I mean, if people want to co-locate, they can. And if it turns out that particularly maybe later in the process, there can be a hybrid, we'll do that. That's really going to be dependent, depending upon, each advisory panel and, the situation as the chairs see it.
We also have a question about who can see the different submissions and if they'll be available for the public.
I haven't, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought through that. Going to have to think about that and get back to you. But honestly, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. If anyone else does, have a thought about that, let me know.
This is Alicia Johnson Turner. I serve as Deputy Executive Director at the Office of Recovery. I think they would be open to Kansas Open Records Act. And so I think they would be subject to that and therefore be able to be made public. I think that this goes to the idea of having more program ideas than specific project ideas. So like I wouldn't put trade secrets and things like that into the submission form.
Thanks, Alicia.
Alicia, can you just describe that distinguishment between project and program a little bit so they're, further understanding?
So when I think about it, a program would be something similar to the $100 million in economic development that the SPARK committee passed out. And so, it's a broad category. And then within that, the Department of Commerce will take grant applications for projects. I think that there may be some exceptions to that. Efficiency and modernization will be probably more project-based, but for many of the other panels, developing programs would be a little bit more of the focus than specific projects. And I think that also helps a little bit when we talk about the conflict of interest and things like that.
Yeah, and that's why, since there's probably going to be a blend of both, right? That we keep referring to it as ideas, right? Rather than necessarily penning it in. And as Alicia mentioned, it may look kind of different from advisory panel to advisory panel because they're looking at different types of areas with different types of needs.
Thanks, Alicia and John. Any other questions from our panelists before we wrap up? Looks like we've answered all the questions thoroughly, John, if you feel good about wrapping up.
Sure. Really appreciate once again, everyone taking the time today for this, everyone signing up for it. Because as you see, this is going to be, a pretty fast process over the next few months. And like I said, I think it's going to be really exciting and make a big difference for Kansas. But we certainly will hit bumps in the road and we will adjust where we need to. We're going to provide a tremendous amount of support for the panels. And I'd say coming out of this session, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk. Thanks.